Welcome to Sleep Landy. This story is meant to be listened to slowly. There is nothing you need to follow or remember. You can simply rest and let the words pass. The Edo period was a long and steady time. For most people, it did not feel like a historical era. It felt like an unchanging present. Japan during these years was orderly and settled. Villages remained in the same places for generations. Families lived where their parents and grandparents had lived before them. Most people belonged to the lower social classes. They were farmers, craftsmen, and laborers. Their lives were shaped by land, weather, and routine. Villages were built near fields and water. The location was practical rather than beautiful. Everything was placed where it was needed. The landscape changed with the seasons. Fields became wet and dark in spring. They turned green in summer. They faded into pale colors in autumn. In winter, they rested. Homes were modest and functional. They provided shelter and warmth. Decoration was minimal. Inside, rooms were quiet and uncluttered. Objects were few and well used. Nothing was kept without purpose. People woke early each day. Morning came without alarm or urgency. Light entered the houses gradually. Work began soon after waking. Movements were familiar and efficient. Each person knew what needed to be done. Clothing was simple and worn often. It was repaired when damaged. New garments were rare. Food was prepared carefully. Meals were similar from day to day. Rice formed the center of the diet. Eating was calm and unremarkable. It marked a pause in work, nothing more. Social order was clear. People understood their role. This understanding created stability. Authority existed at a distance. Rules were followed quietly. Daily life continued without interruption. As daylight faded, work slowed. Evenings were quiet and dim. People returned home. Night brought rest. Sleep came naturally. The next day followed the same pattern. Days passed without distinction. Years moved forward gently. This was the rhythm of life for many generations. Village homes during the Edo period were built with careful simplicity. They were not designed to impress or display wealth. They were designed to endure seasons and daily use. The structure of a house followed familiar patterns. Wooden beams formed the frame. Walls were made from a mixture of clay, straw, and wood. Roofs were covered with thatch or tiles, depending on the region. The floor inside the house was raised slightly above the ground. This helped keep out moisture and insects. Shoes were left at the entrance. The interior remained clean and orderly. Rooms were separated by sliding doors. These doors were light and easy to move. They allowed spaces to change according to need. In the morning, doors might be opened. In the evening, they were closed again. Tatami mats covered much of the floor. They were woven from straw and grass. The surface was firm but slightly soft. They were replaced only when worn beyond repair. Furniture was minimal. Most activities took place close to the floor. People sat, worked, and ate in the same general area. Nothing was higher than it needed to be. Storage spaces were small and carefully arranged. Clothing was folded neatly. Tools were kept in designated places. Every object had a known location. The hearth was an important part of the home. It provided warmth and a place to cook. Smoke escaped through openings in the roof. Over time, the wood above darkened from use. Mornings began quietly. Before speaking, people often listened to the sounds outside. The wind, distant footsteps, and birds signaled the start of the day. The first tasks were simple. Bedding was folded and stored. Doors were slid open to let in light. The air inside the house slowly changed. Water was fetched from nearby sources. Buckets were carried steadily and without haste. This task was repeated every day without variation. Breakfast was prepared in the same way each morning. Rice was washed, then cooked. Vegetables were cleaned and cut. Everything followed a familiar order. Meals were eaten without rush. People sat quietly. They focused on the act of eating. After breakfast, tools were gathered. Work clothes were adjusted. The day's labor began. Children observed and assisted. They learned through repetition. Instruction came through example, not explanation. The house remained mostly empty during the day. It waited silently for the evening return. Sunlight moved across the interior. Shadows shifted gradually. Nothing interrupted this movement. This pattern repeated daily. Morning followed night. Routine followed rest. The home served as a stable center. It changed little over time. It supported a life of regularity. Agriculture formed the foundation of life for most people during the Edo period. The rhythm of the year was shaped by planting and harvesting. Fields required constant attention, but rarely sudden effort. Rice cultivation was the most important task. It followed a strict seasonal pattern. Preparation began long before seeds were placed in the ground. Fields were divided into small sections. Each section was bordered by narrow paths and low embankments. Water flowed slowly through channels connecting one field to another. Before planting, the soil was softened. Farmers worked methodically, using simple tools. Wooden hoes and plows were passed down through families. Work in the fields began early. People moved steadily, without speaking much. Each motion had been practiced for years. Seedlings were planted by hand. Rows were kept straight and evenly spaced. This careful placement helped ensure even growth. Water levels were monitored closely. Too much water could damage the plants. Too little would slow their growth. Throughout the growing season, fields were maintained. Weeds were removed. Embankments were repaired. Channels were cleared of debris. The sun moved slowly overhead. Clouds passed without urgency. Time was marked by the position of the light. Clothing protected against weather. Sleeves were tied back. Hats shielded faces from sun and rain. Breaks were brief. People rested at the edge of the fields. They drank water and ate small portions of food. Tools were treated with care. After use, they were cleaned. Damage was repaired immediately. Harvest season brought longer hours. Plants were cut and gathered. Bundles were carried by hand. Grain was separated and dried. This process required patience. Nothing was rushed. Work continued until daylight faded. Fatigue was expected and accepted. It was part of the cycle. When the fields were empty, attention shifted to preparation for the next season. Storage areas were checked. Supplies were counted. Even in winter, tasks remained. Tools were maintained. Plans were quietly considered. Farming was not a single activity. It was a continuous process. Each stage led naturally to the next. This labor repeated year after year. Generations followed the same routines. Fields remained in use, unchanged. The work was steady and predictable. It demanded endurance rather than strength. It shaped both body and time. Food preparation during the Edo period followed a steady and familiar sequence. It was not creative or experimental. It relied on known methods and predictable results. The kitchen area was simple. It was usually close to the hearth. Utensils were few and well worn. Rice required careful handling. Before cooking, it was measured. The amount depended on the household size and the day's labor. Grains were placed into a wooden container. Water was added slowly. Hands moved through the rice to remove excess starch and dust. This washing process was repeated several times. Each repetition followed the same motion. There was no need to hurry. After washing, the rice rested briefly. It absorbed moisture. During this time, other preparations continued. Vegetables were gathered earlier in the day. They were stored in cool areas of the house. Before use, they were rinsed and trimmed. Cutting was done with steady movements. Pieces were made uniform. Nothing was wasted. Cooking began with the careful lighting of the fire. Wood was arranged to allow slow burning. Flames were controlled through experience, not measurement. Pots were placed over the heat. Lids were adjusted. The sound of boiling was familiar and reassuring. Meals were not elaborate. They were meant to sustain energy. Balance mattered more than variety. Eating took place at set times. People gathered without conversation. Each person focused on their portion. Bowls were filled modestly. No one ate more than necessary. Leftovers were rare. After eating, dishes were cleaned immediately. Water was used sparingly. Everything returned to its place. Rest followed naturally. It was not planned, it occurred between tasks. People sat quietly. They watched light move across the room. Breathing slowed. These moments were brief but regular. They provided recovery without stopping the day entirely. Food preparation happened again in the evening. The steps were the same. The pace remained unchanged. As darkness approached, meals became smaller. The body prepared for rest. Energy was conserved. This pattern repeated daily. The sequence did not change with mood or weather. Only the ingredients shifted slightly with the seasons. Over years, these actions became automatic. Hands moved without thought. The mind remained calm. Food was not a source of pleasure or excitement. It was part of order. It marked time quietly. Evenings during the Edo period did not begin suddenly. They arrived gradually as the light softened and shadows grew longer. There was no clear moment when day became evening. Work naturally came to an end as visibility decreased. Tasks that required precision were set aside. Only simple, familiar actions remained. Tools were cleaned with care. Dirt was removed from wooden surfaces. Metal parts were wiped and stored. Paths leading back to the village were walked slowly. There was no reason to hurry. The destination was already known. As people returned home, the atmosphere changed. Movements became smaller. Voices, if used at all, were low. Inside the house, light was limited. Oil lamps were lit only when needed. The glow they provided was soft and uneven. Evening meals followed the same pattern as earlier ones. Portions were smaller. Preparation was simpler. After eating, the space was cleared again. Bowls were washed. Surfaces were wiped. Time after the evening meal passed quietly. People remained seated. Hands rested. Some tasks were still completed. Clothing was mended. Tools were checked for damage. These activities required little thought. They were done slowly. Repetition guided the hands. Seasonal changes influenced the evenings. In summer, windows were left open. Air moved freely through the house. In winter, openings were closed carefully. Heat was preserved. The interior became still. Autumn evenings were cooler. Spring evenings were damp. Each season adjusted the atmosphere slightly. Darkness deepened without urgency. The outside world became indistinct. Sounds softened. Night insects were heard in warmer months. Wind moved through trees. Occasional footsteps passed by. Inside, people prepared for sleep. Bedding was laid out carefully. Familiar motions guided the process. There was no reflection on the day, no anticipation of tomorrow. Sleep was expected and accepted. As bodies rested, the village grew quiet. Lights were extinguished one by one. Movement ceased. Night settled fully. It remained until morning. Nothing disturbed its presence. This pattern repeated each evening, across seasons, across years. Evenings were not endings, they were pauses, necessary and predictable. And so night followed day, and day followed night, without interruption. Years during the Edo period did not announce themselves. They passed quietly, marked only by familiar seasonal changes. Spring followed winter, and winter followed autumn, as it always had. People did not measure time by age as precisely as later generations would. Life was divided into stages recognized by responsibility rather than numbers. Childhood, working years, and old age blended into one another. Children grew by observing. They learned tasks gradually. No single moment marked the beginning of adulthood. As strength increased, responsibilities expanded. Younger bodies took on more demanding work. This transition happened without ceremony. Adults followed established routines. The days were full but predictable. There was little variation from year to year. Aging was not discussed often. It was visible through posture and pace. Work was adjusted quietly as bodies changed. Older members of the household shifted to lighter tasks. They repaired tools, they prepared materials. Knowledge was shared indirectly. Methods were demonstrated. Repetition served as instruction. Homes remained occupied by multiple generations. Space was shared without negotiation. This arrangement was expected. The rhythm of life adjusted gradually. Faster movement slowed. Heavier work was passed on. Seasons continued to structure time. Planting returned each spring. Harvest followed in autumn. Land remained constant. Fields were worked as before. Boundaries stayed the same. Occasionally, new buildings were added. Old ones were repaired. The village shape evolved gradually. Life did not aim toward progress. It aimed toward continuity. Maintaining balance was enough. Generations overlapped. Roles shifted without disruption. The cycle continued. People lived within the same patterns their ancestors had followed. They did not question this. It was familiar and stable. Time moved forward quietly, without urgency, without resistance. This steady passage defined life. Not moments, but duration. Not events, but repetition. Weather during the Edo period was not a topic of discussion. It was a constant presence rather than an event. People adjusted to it without comment. Rain arrived when it arrived. Sometimes it lasted for hours, sometimes for days. During rainy periods, movement slowed further. Paths became soft. Fields reflected the sky. Work continued whenever possible. Tasks were adapted. Nothing was forced. Clear days brought brightness without excitement. Sunlight warmed the ground. Shadows became sharper. Wind passed through villages quietly. It moved roof thatch. It carried familiar sounds. Humidity changed the feel of the air. Summer became heavy and still. Breathing adjusted naturally. Cold seasons required preparation. Openings were sealed, clothing layers increased. Snow, when it came, muted sound. Footsteps softened. The landscape simplified. Weather influenced posture and pace. Movements followed conditions. No resistance was shown. Nature was not admired or feared. It was accepted. It shaped routine without intention. Life during the Edo period was made of small movements. These movements were not noticed individually. Together, they formed the shape of each day. Hands moved toward familiar objects without hesitation. Fingers wrapped around handles worn smooth by use. Weight was lifted, carried, and set down again. Feet followed paths shaped by years of walking. The ground responded in expected ways. Balance adjusted automatically. Doors were opened with gentle pressure. They slid along tracks without sound. Later, they were closed in the same manner. Water was poured carefully. The level in a container rose steadily. Spills were rare. Clothing was adjusted throughout the day. Sleeves were tied back, then released. Fabric shifted with movement. These actions occurred in no particular order. They repeated naturally. They required little awareness. Life during the Edo period was made of small movements. These movements were not noticed individually. Together, they formed the shape of each day. Hands moved toward familiar objects without hesitation. Fingers wrapped around handles worn smooth by use. Weight was lifted, carried, and set down again. Feet followed paths shaped by years of walking. The ground responded in expected ways. Balance adjusted automatically. Doors were opened with gentle pressure. They slid along tracks without sound. Later, they were closed in the same manner. Water was poured carefully. The level in a container rose steadily. Spills were rare. Clothing was adjusted throughout the day. Sleeves were tied back, then released. Fabric shifted with movement. These actions occurred in no particular order. They repeated naturally. They required little awareness. Between tasks, there were pauses. These pauses were not planned. They existed simply because movement slowed. Breathing followed a steady rhythm. Inhalations and exhalations balanced each other. No effort was needed. Light changed gradually. Shadows lengthened and shortened. Surfaces reflected brightness differently as the day progressed. Sounds remained consistent. Footsteps passed at known intervals. Wind moved through familiar spaces. The mind did not focus on the present moment. Attention drifted lightly. Thoughts were unformed. Time felt extended. Minutes did not separate themselves clearly. Hours blended together. Work was completed without noticing its end. Rest arrived without announcement. Both were part of the same flow. Repeated gestures created a sense of continuity. Nothing stood out. Nothing demanded reaction. The body carried memory. Each action reinforced the next. Patterns deepened over time. This repetition did not cause boredom. It created stability. Stability brought calm. Over years, these movements became life itself. They defined existence without words. They continued without interruption. Roads during the Edo period were not places of motion. They were extensions of the land itself. Most of the time, they remained empty. Paths connected villages in simple ways. They followed the shape of the terrain. Straight lines were uncommon. The surface of a road changed gradually. Packed earth became loose soil. Stones appeared and disappeared. Footprints accumulated slowly. Rain softened their edges. Time erased them. Travel was infrequent. Most people remained near their homes. Movement beyond the village was unnecessary. When travel did occur, it was planned carefully. Distance mattered. Time was considered. Walking was the usual method. Pace was steady. Stops were expected. Loads were carried evenly. Weight was balanced. Strain was minimized. Roadside features passed quietly. Trees offered shade. Streams crossed the path. No signs marked direction. Knowledge came from familiarity. Landmarks were remembered. Sounds traveled far on open roads. Footsteps echoed softly. Wind moved freely. Travel did not change perspective. It was part of routine when required. The destination was known. Returning home felt natural. The road did not hold meaning. It simply existed. Most days passed without travel. Paths remained unused. Stillness returned. The presence of roads did not encourage movement. It allowed it when necessary. Otherwise, life stayed centered. Distance was accepted. Effort was measured. Energy was conserved. Movement through space was rare. Life unfolded in place. Continuity remained unbroken. Much of life during the Edo period was spent waiting, not waiting for something specific, but waiting as a natural state between tasks. People waited for light to change, they waited for water to heat, they waited for weather to shift. This waiting did not feel empty, it felt normal. It filled the day quietly. Standing still was common. A person might pause without intention. Body weight would shift slightly from one foot to the other. Hands rested at the sides. Fingers relaxed. Nothing needed to be held. Eyes looked outward without focus. The landscape remained familiar. No detail demanded attention. Sounds existed at a distance. They were not listened to directly. They formed a steady background. A bird might move. Wind might pass. Neither required response. Time during these moments did not advance in clear steps. It stretched. It softened. Thoughts appeared briefly, then faded. Plans were unnecessary. Memory did not linger. People did not fill silence intentionally. Silence was not uncomfortable. It belonged to the place. Between tasks, the body remained ready, not tense, just prepared. Muscles stayed loose. Breathing stayed even. Posture adjusted naturally. Waiting happened indoors and outdoors, near doorways, beside fields. Sometimes waiting ended without notice. A task resumed. Movement returned. Sometimes waiting continued until the day changed. Light dimmed. Temperature shifted. These long, unmarked periods formed the majority of life. They were not recorded. They were not remembered individually. Over years, waiting shaped perception. Urgency disappeared. Patience became habitual. People learned to exist without filling time, without needing progress, without expectation. This stillness was not intentional practice. It emerged naturally. It was reinforced daily. Villages themselves seemed to wait. Buildings stood quietly. Paths held their shape. Fields waited between seasons. Tools waited between uses. Homes waited between occupants. Even generations waited. Children grew slowly. Elders faded gradually. Nothing rushed this process. Nothing interrupted it. Continuity remained intact. Life did not move forward sharply. It expanded outward. It settled into itself. Waiting became indistinguishable from living. Stillness became familiar. Time became wide. And within that wide time, days continued, unchanged and unremarkable, flowing calmly, without need for conclusion. Life during the Edo period did not move toward a conclusion. It simply continued. Days followed one another without distinction. No single morning stood apart. No evening demanded attention. People lived within patterns that required no reflection. They woke, worked, rested, and slept. The sequence repeated quietly. Years accumulated without being counted. Seasonal changes marked time gently. Nothing insisted on remembrance. Homes remained in place. Fields were worked again and again. Paths held their shape. Generations passed through the same spaces. Movements softened. Responsibilities shifted. There was no sense of arrival, no moment of completion, only continuation. Life did not ask to be understood. It did not need explanation. It simply unfolded. The world remained familiar. Routine provided structure. Stability brought calm. And so, life moved forward, not quickly, not slowly, but steadily. It continued through quiet mornings, through unremarkable days, through long, silent nights. It continued without emphasis, without pause, without end. And as this story becomes quieter and the words grow lighter, there is nothing left to follow. Only rest, only stillness, only sleep.